You go. Thanks, Lauren. And my name is Frank Garner, and I'm a board member with Montanans for Election Reform. And it's my pleasure to be able to join you tonight for this AFL CIO Town Hall meeting. And we are grateful for your time and your interest in this topic. The reason we think that this is so timely is because we really just have 19 days left in our election cycle with these issues that are so important and critical to Montana. Really, we have until 8 p.m. on November 5th to make sure that our voices are heard. And so we think it's critically important that we both help make sure that we've answered people's questions, educated them on the initiatives, and that they understand how critical they are to Montana's future. So thanks again for joining us tonight. And with that, I'm going to give you back to Lauren, who can get our program started.
Hi, and you've got Frank and I both joining from phones, so sorry if the video is a little bit funny, but as I mentioned, I'm Lauren Caldwell. I'm campaign manager for CI-126 and CI-127, and we're really grateful for the partnership of the AFL CIO. AFL CIO was an early endorser of our initiatives before we even qualified for the ballot, helped make sure that we had the momentum to get on the ballot, and we're grateful for the partnership all the way through to Election Day. I come from the labor world. Most recently, I was political director at Montana Federation of Public Employees, and so this it's really nice to kind of be back home in the labor family. And I even have my AFL shirt on today, so if you can see that. But it's great to talk to you all about this, and we'll go through a presentation, but then welcome your questions. Specifically, the way that this will work today is that we'll hold the Q&A session following a brief presentation on the initiative. So you can use the Q&A app at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions. So we can, and then our team will be monitoring the questions box and compiling questions to ask of myself or Frank at the end of our time together. And, you know, feel free to ask questions from anyone at AFL CIO as well. They're very well versed in this, in these initiatives, and we'll have a few different representatives from local unions here next. And then you can also find more information about the initiatives at our website, so we'll throw that into the chat as well. Now, it's my sincere pleasure to turn it over to Jason Small, Mafi Funk, and Jackie Helt to talk about why these initiatives matter for them and the membership they represent, and then we'll get into the presentation. So Jason, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, as far as just a warm up here, this is of the utmost importance. Elections have consequences. We often say that, and it really truly is true, right? And with this initiative, we have the ability to change the landscape of how things operate and hopefully make it where we get a slate of candidates in front of us that are actually usable. We knock the bat off both sides and run down the middle and score touchdowns forever. So that's where we're at.
I like that analogy. All right, Mafi, would you like to speak?
Hi, my name is Mafi Funk. I'm a retired middle school social studies teacher. How fun is that? I'm former state representative, secretary of the resurgent Montana Alliance for Retired Americans, and a very, very staunch and passionate supporter of labor. I'm supporting CI-126, quite frankly, because some of the brightest and most knowledgeable brains in Montana talked to me about it and educated me. And as an educator, I'm absolutely thrilled with the arc that CI-126 has taken. I'll admit that a year and a half ago, I was on the fence, but after being educated, I'm all in. And what I've found is that when you talk to people and explain it to them, they're all on board too. I'm on the doors a lot, and as soon as I explain what CI-126 does, why it's not just necessary, but a great idea, almost invariably they go, yeah, you're right. Change can be scary, but if you are educated about why change is necessary, it's much less difficult. Most states require people to declare their party affiliation when they register to vote. Montana does not, and I have always been extraordinarily proud of this. So when we register to vote, we don't have to say what party we belong to or what party we feel aligns with our values. We just register to vote. So why is it that in our primaries, we have to declare which partisan ballot we want? It seems hypocritical, and contrary to our values as Montanans, and undermines the confidence in our system. CI-126 gives Montanans the freedom to choose. I hope all of you will vote for CI-126 and tell all your friends and neighbors, and maybe even those people you don't like very much, that they really do, that this really does lift us all up. Thank you.
Thanks, Mafi. And next up, Jackie.
You better take the mute off. Hello, everyone. My name is Jackie Helt, and I serve as the Montana State Director of SEIU 775. We're a union representing long-term healthcare workers in Montana, Washington, and Alaska. I've also had the honor of serving on the Montana AFL CIO Executive Board since 1998, and I've been a labor lobbyist since 1993. And let me tell you, I've seen some things in those years. I've definitely seen some things at that Capitol. We are supporting CI-126 and 127 for the simple fact that we need elected officials to work in the best interests of working people. Right now, that's not happening. And a lot of things have to do with partisan primaries. In the last election, listen very closely, 8% of US voters effectively elected 83% of Congress. And the problem is even worse here in Montana. In the 2022 election, 6% of the Montana electorate effectively elected 88% of our state house. You know, that means that the election was actually over in June, before November even hit. This contributes to politicians catering to the far wings of their partisan base, rather than reaching out to the majority of the electorate to see what issues matter to them and to work to fix those problems that matter to everyday Montanans. A majority of Montanans don't put themselves in the partisan box and would likely call themselves independent. But partisan primaries force voters to choose a party ballot just to make their voice heard in the primary. It's not only fundamentally undemocratic, but it's producing really bad results for working people. We need elected officials to work together to find the best solutions for Montanans and our families. But if we're stuck in partisan gridlock by partisan primaries, we will see more uncontested elections and partisan primaries and overall less competition. We strongly believe that politicians should have to work to earn the support of working people, and CI-126 and 127 will do just that.
Thanks, Jackie. And thanks, Mafi. And I think we're going to return to Jason. And if you had additional remarks, I think we were doing kind of our intros there, and want to hear what else you had to say about the reforms as well.
Yeah, sorry about that. I thought we were just going to do a brief intro to start with, but that's my fault. I don't pay attention to much of anything, I guess. Anyhow, back to me. Just as an introduction for myself, my name is Jason Small. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Montana AFL CIO, which is a federation of unions that represents over 50,000 working Montanans, their retirees and their families. And I'm also a sitting state senator. Currently, I am terming out here directly, but I've kind of lived the legislative process now for around a decade, and I got a little bit more to say, I guess. So it's become pretty apparent over the years that the best legislation comes from bipartisanship and people working together. That's what creates the greatest outcome. And it doesn't matter if it's Medicaid expansion, campaign finance reform, balancing our budget, mental health reform, or just protecting our rights to collectively bargain for better deals. These are all building blocks for a healthy civil society. but they only happen when we elect people who are seeking to find solutions. And sorry, I was getting a phone call. And consensus and hold similar values and put their ideological differences aside. Sorry, can you still hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, sorry, I lost my connection there. Elected leaders have a difficult job, right? They're made harder by election cycles that are decided before most voters in our state even get a chance to meaningfully participate. Building policy consensus and listening to the concerns of people fighting for a better future for their families is something that shouldn't be taken for granted. And that's why we need elections that put voters first. Effectively, CI-126 and 127 end partisan gridlock. It'll no longer create a route to punish legislators for getting things done for their constituents and communities. Partisan primaries right now reward politicians who cater to the most extreme of their base. And it also disincentivizes finding the solution we need to live better, or solutions we need to better the lives of workers and their families. So let's take the initiative right now to fix the system and get politics back on the right track. So the government is working for us, the people, instead of against us, and just looking out for the wants and needs of large corporations and special interest groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate all of you speaking to why members of the AFL CIO and associated unions are all getting behind these reforms. We really appreciate it. So now we'll jump into our presentation tonight. Erin's going to run it, especially with me on my phone, and you might hear my kids in the background here. They don't have volume control really down, but I will. Frank and I are going to kind of go back and forth here. So go ahead and go to the first slide, Erin. Frank.
Well, thanks again. My name is, as I mentioned, Frank Garner. I grew up in Montana. I'm a career police officer. I was also a four-term legislator and was termed out and had to decide here in the last couple of years what I wanted to really invest my time and my experience in. And I really decided clearly that it was these two initiatives. I think they are the most important thing for us to consider on our ballot this year because they affect essentially every thing that we do and the power that elected officials have over our lives. So I became a member of Montanans for Election Reform. It's a ballot committee, bipartisan. You can see some of the folks on there, and I'll bet you'll see some names that you recognize. It's Republicans, Democrats, independents, that believe in the same mission, and that's to put people back in charge of their election system. And we're going to tell you here in a minute why you're not, but you should know this is a Montana-led effort by a growing coalition of people who believe that we can do better and that our government must do better. And so our goals are first to protect your freedom to choose. And I'll use myself as an example. In Flathead County this year, I had 4 ballots in the primary. I had to choose one of those. And when I chose that one, it made me ineligible to consider anyone else on those other 3 ballots. So I don't have the freedom to vote for somebody for one position that is represented by a party and somebody else in a different party for another position. We don't have the freedom to do that. And that's increasingly a big deal because, as you heard from Jackie, we elect essentially the majority of our representatives in primaries. Those people are the ones that go on to serve, and they are elected by a small minority of people. We'll give you some examples later, but to start with, I can't believe that I don't have that freedom and that I have to ask somebody's permission to decide what small portion of the people eligible to be on the ballot I can vote for. It's a time for us, our goals to put voters first, not political parties and not special interests. And these reforms we're going to talk about do that, and they incentivize the right behavior. And so it's a way for us to hold politicians more accountable. As somebody who's been there and in a semi-swing district, I had to talk to people, campaign hard. I had to build coalitions. I had to compromise sometimes to try to find the best solution for the people I represented. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it made me a worse representative. And we need a election system that incentivizes that behavior. We don't have it now. And it's important that we align our election system with the values of Montanans, and that we get back to the people that are elected having to worry more about what you, the voter, have on their mind and what's important to you than the special interests out there. So that's our organization. Those are our goals. And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to talk a little bit about the initiatives themselves.
Thanks. So what problem is this trying to solve? There are a lot of issues with our current election system. I think Frank often says, like, raise your hand if you feel like politics in America today is going swimmingly. If you think it's going great, these may not be the ballot measures for you, but actually there are a lot of problems with our current system, and specifically ones that these constitutional initiatives help address. So the current system, as Frank described it, limits your freedom to choose who you want to vote for in the primary. You don't get to choose any person running for office. You can only choose one party's ballot and vote that. And roughly 40% of Montana voters don't identify with a party. About 40% of Montana voters consider themselves independent. I don't think any of you that are living in Montana, I'm sure you recognize that Montana is a fiercely independent state. And historically, they have exercised that on the ballot. Voters have exercised that on the ballot. It limits competition and participation. Our current system, only about 40% of Montana voters participated in the 2024 primary. And in many of those races, there's a lack of competition in the general election. So we spoke to the numbers I'll share in a second, but there's actually not another candidate on the ballot in many cases, because people can see the writing on the wall that it's going to be won by a Republican or a Democrat, so why even try? And so in 2022, there were 36 campaigns across the state that didn't have an opponent in the general election. That's not a fair democracy. That's not a democracy where people have choice in who they're going to have representing them. And this system is really vulnerable to special interests and big money. We're seeing that, obviously, all of the big money spending in our elections. But when you reduce it down to just a small group of people making the decisions in the primary, it's even easier to influence that choke point in the system with lots of money. And it incentivizes extreme policy positions. I know when I worked for the Montana Federation of Public Employees, I went to the legislature. I would lobby legislators on issues important to that organization. And often we would come up against legislators, and I know the legislators that are here tonight can attest to this, that would say, oh, I agree with you that X, Y, or Z policy is important, but I can't vote that way and make it through my primary. So what they were focused on wasn't what do the majority of my constituents want? What do the majority of the folks in my district want? They were focused on what do a majority of people who are going to vote on my side of the primary want from me? And that gives a real outsized influence to a very small and more extreme group of our electorate. And it's no surprise that these kinds of things result in division and gridlock and people getting entrenched on their sides instead of being able to work together. The box to the top right says in 2022, only 8% of US voters effectively elected 83% of the United States Congress. So this exists at a national level as well. And so we have a data expert on our team, and she ran the numbers for Montana. And in 2022, the same year, only 6% of Montana voters effectively elected 88% of the Montana House. So the vast majority of our legislators are getting chosen in the primary by this very small group of people. And that's why our politicians, I think this is a chord that AFL hits really well in these initiatives. That's why our politicians feel so out of whack from the average person in Montana, and what they think is important and why they're not addressing the issues we think are most important. Go on, Aaron. Frank, you want to take these?
You bet. So the first one I want to talk about, of course, is CI-126. When we talk about what the solutions are to some of the issues that we've identified. And so to begin with, CI-126 has truly open primaries where you could get to vote on a ballot that has everyone's name that is eligible to be on the ballot. You now get to choose from everyone who is eligible to decide who you want to represent you. And then from there, we have the top 4 that move on to the general election. So you have both the freedom to choose who you want, there is more competition, and we have the ability in the fall election where the majority of people are actually going to vote to have that choice and competition and ability to hold these folks accountable for their performance. In addition, there's CI-127 that says when we get to the general election, the winner has to have a majority of the vote, 50+1. And we know that's important because that helps people build coalitions, govern more broadly, and worry about what a broader section of the electorate thinks and wants in performing their job. Now, I'm going to use the Eastern congressional race as an example. This year, right, where we had the winner in the primary got, I want to say it's 35 or 6% in a election where about 40% of registered voters voted. So if you do the math, that means about 15% of actual registered voters chose the winner in that primary, who everyone agrees is going to be presumptively the congressional nominee in the Eastern District. So 15% got to choose them, 85% didn't get to vote for or didn't vote for that person, and yet that's who's going to go on to represent the Eastern District of Montana in Congress. It's why special interests love to see that choke point. They know as a state we're a cheap date. And, the influence that is put on those representatives by a small number of people often drives really what is happening in our policy. So when you wonder why we have division and polarization, and why those people aren't talking about the things you're talking about at your kitchen table, it's because they're not. Because 85–90% of the registered voters, the people in Montana, their voice is not being heard. And that's why CI-126 and CI-127 are so important. Next slide, please. And this just gives you a little bit more information as we walk through CI-126, and I won't read through all the details on that, other than the importance of giving you the freedom to vote for who you want and the right to do that, to having more competition and more responsive government. We say competition's a great thing in everything we do except politics, right? That affects basically every corner of our life. And then with CI-127, you can again see the importance of elected officials having to worry about a broader majority of people's opinion, actual voters, Montanans, what they think, what they want to have happen in our state and in our policy. Unlike now, where such a small percentage is constantly exploited by special interests. Next, please. Lauren, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the main effects, please?
So we often get asked, is this sort of Republicans think it's a trick from the Democrats and Democrats think it's a trick from the Republicans. And as Frank often says, like, it can't be both. These reforms don't benefit either party. They're not about that. They're about putting power back in the hands of voters and having elected leaders who represent the majority of their constituents and are forced to care about what the majority of their constituents care about. So they increase competition by simply allowing more candidates, regardless of party, to advance to the general election. They undercut extremism and polarization by requiring candidates to build broad coalitions across the electorate, like we said. And they change the incentives, which I spoke to earlier in my experience lobbying the legislature, by shifting, the people that those legislators are focused on from being a subset of the primary electorate to being the majority of their general electorate. And better candidates choose to run in a better system. So we will speak to this in a second, but we've seen the effects of this. And we specifically, I shouldn't even say we because I came on after this, but the folks that were working on this have been working on this for years, really intentionally chose these to be constitutional reforms, because then the hands of the legislature are tied in them, and they have to abide the will of the people. We're really lucky in Montana to have a strong citizens initiative process. And we sure took advantage of that, because the people who are in power are not the ones who want to give more power to voters. So we took advantage of Montana's citizen initiative process to get on the ballot. Anyway, we know these things not because we're guessing, but because we aren't the first state to try it. And the best to look to is the next slide, which is Alaska. So in Alaska, they passed reform in 2020. And so it went into effect in 2022. It's a top 4 open primary, and what they found was that there was a huge increase in ticket splitting, meaning people who voted for a Republican U.S. Senator, a Democrat for U.S. Congress, a Republican for governor, that was really the majority of Alaskans, and they were allowed to do that under the new system. They were allowed to exercise that freedom of choice a lot more than they had been under their prior system. And what happened in the legislature was pretty phenomenal. It didn't change much the partisan makeup of the legislature. Same number of Democrats, a few more independents, and nearly the same number of Republicans. But what it did was change the way they behaved, and it changed it immediately. So, I mean, this is kind of in the realm of fantasy to imagine, but immediately after the passage of reform, what we would call here Solutions Caucus Republicans joined. These are folks who have stood up regularly for labor and for other critical issues to Montanans. They joined in Alaska with independents and Democrats to form their own bipartisan governing majority. They chose who was on committees. They chose what bills came up to the floor. And surprise, surprise, when they started to focus on what most people care about, they started working, as they said, you can see the quote here, in the middle, not the far right or the far left. And they focused on issues including lowering energy costs, improving education, revitalizing the economy, really bread and butter issues instead of the hot button stuff that gets people riled up in those primary elections. They were focusing on things that matter to most of us. If you go to the next slide. And so we can talk more about Alaska if folks are interested. But again, we saw people having more freedom of choice, exercising that freedom of choice, and getting to cast their vote for different people on the ballot than they had been able to before. This is kind of our concluding slide. These are simple common sense reforms. They come from Montanans who've been considering this for a long time. They give voters more freedom, more choice, and more accountable leadership. And I think with that, we transition to, we do have one more slide. So we have found that it's really remarkable to look back at some of the Founding Fathers documents and the warnings they gave about putting power in the hands of political parties. So George Washington specifically warned Americans when working on the Constitution that putting too much power in the hands of two political parties would subvert the power of the people. And we're seeing that. Politicians are less and less accountable to us, and we need power over our elections to come back to us. And the way to break that grip of the parties is to change the way we do our primary system. Okay, you can skip that for now. We can come back to those questions if folks aren't sure what they want to ask, but I'd love to just now send it back to the group. Aaron, I think you've got access to all the questions, and anybody can start typing them in if you haven't in the Q&A button there on the screen, and we can probably take down the presentation too and just see everybody's faces. Aaron, do we have questions in the Q&A?
Yes, we have one question. Will candidates still label themselves as Republican or Democrat?
Yes.
Frank, do you want to? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Frank
and-
can answer it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so parties will still exist and still have the ability to identify with candidates and people who they feel like match whatever checklist that they have. But on the ballot, you're going to have everybody who's eligible, regardless of party, in front of you. And just like a municipal election or one for the courts, those kind of things, you're going to have the ability to look at everybody with respect to who they are and how you think they're going to represent you. And they're all going to appear on one ballot, and you're going to be able to choose between them.
Yeah, I would add to that, it doesn't change anything about the way that we file as candidates now. So right now, if I go to file for office, I can choose whether I file as a Republican or a Democrat or run as an independent or a Green Party. That's up to me, because that's really my choice, right? To say what party best represents who I am to the people that are going to be voting in my election. And this doesn't change that. So it might mean that more people and more diverse group of parties and candidates advance to the general election, but it doesn't change the fact that there is people will put down a party preference just like they do now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The next question we have is, can you explain how the legislature plays a part in CI-127?
Yes, first, you really have to have the weeds decided of what process will be used to determine that majority winner. So the legislature doesn't get to pick who wins. They only get to help decide what the process is. They really only have two choices. That's what's being used out in the world. One is ranked choice or the runoff election. So ranked choice like in Alaska, or a runoff election like in Georgia. And we've added additional language to the initiatives to make sure there's a very narrow path. And we also see our coalition as being really good stewards of both the initiative process and of these initiatives to make sure that work gets done well. But because we have a single subject rule in Montana, we'd have to have essentially two additional initiatives if we were going to try to decide that. And we think that would be both difficult and confusing, and that this process allows for the public inputs that is necessary for us to be able to choose a system that we know will work for Montana.
Yeah, something I emphasize when folks are worried about the language in CI-127 that says, as determined by the legislature, is just to remember that, and I said this at the beginning, but these are constitutional for a reason. They are not giving the legislature some authority that they don't currently have. The legislature could at any time choose to change our systems of elections. We are actually constraining the powers of the legislature and their authority to make sure that they abide by a new system that better reflects the will of the people. Next up, Aaron.
That is all the questions that we have laid out. But if folks have more questions, the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. You can submit a question if you'd like. You can submit it anonymously. So do want to give you opportunities to submit those now. So happy to answer them.
Yeah, and we really appreciate those questions, because we hope to be able to make sure that you have all the information you need to make this important decision. Remember, to get here, we had to go out and get signatures from well over 100,000 Montanans to put these on the ballot and to give you the chance to choose this system. And if you think the folks in power and the special interests are worried, you don't have to take my word for it, you take theirs. If you look at how hard some of the people in power have worked to keep you, the Montana voter, from even having the right to make this decision, it should tell you everything you need to know. I'm just a volunteer, and the reason I'm here is because I think this is the most important thing for my state and for my family and for my community. And the only thing I really get out of it at the end of the day is the same thing you do, and that's one vote. And I know I'm going to use my vote to put Montanans back in charge of their election system by voting for CI-126 and 127, because I think it's the one thing that can return power to the people and to limit the outreach of special interests and those people that want to put power in the hands of a few people. So, please reach out to us and let us know if there is, are any questions that we can help you with, or anything else that we can help do to help you make good decisions on these initiatives. And Lauren, I just pass it back to you to see if you had any other remarks that you wanted to close with.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, and Aaron, if there are other questions that roll in, feel free to jump in here. I'll touch on a couple that come up, that have been coming up. So, what if one passes and the other doesn't pass? That's a common question for us. These are, if we could have put them together, we would have. In Montana, we have strict single subject laws, which would prohibit us from putting two different set pieces of policy into one ballot measure. So we couldn't do that. So we think they are important complementary policies, but either can stand alone. So don't feel like if you're talking to someone and they're, they say they're going to vote for 126, but they're not going to vote for 127 or vice versa. You don't have to kind of beat down their door. It's 126 is the most sort of critical one to pass constitutionally, because 127 we can implement legislatively, but we want you to know that that either policy can stand on its own, that we wouldn't have proposed them if that wasn't the case. And I think we've covered some of the other most common questions. One that I'm seeing pop up a fair amount is people confusing this with a top two system. So so they'll say like, but if we do that, we'll never have a Democrat on the ballot in Montana or something like that. Under a top two system, like California's, now our opponents are saying this is like California. It's not, because California has a top two system. And that sounds small, the difference between 2 and 4, but it's actually quite a large difference in policy. So a top two system is much more likely to have what's called lockout, where one party is represented on the final ballot, only one party. There's 2 Democrats or there's 2 Republicans. But a top 4 system is incredibly different that way. So statistically, it's just extraordinarily unlikely that you would end up having lockout where some party wasn't represented when you have a top 4 system. What these systems do is let the primary still be a winnowing factor. So if you had 12 candidates running, it would winnow that down for the general election. It just wouldn't choose your ultimate winners, because that really should be happening in the general election. Aaron, any other questions come through?
No other questions. So I think if folks don't have any questions, I put the info at Montanans for Election Reform email in the chat, as well as the AFL CIO webpage around open primaries in the chat as well. But yeah, I think Lauren or Frank, if either of you want to close this out.
I think Frank
I would.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I would just offer to the folks, this is not a gimmick. I spent a year in Afghanistan where I saw people literally risk their lives for the chance to vote, right? It is the most powerful tool you have And it only works if you use it. And we're asking, of course, for your support for these because we think it puts you back in charge of the system, and we trust Montanans to do that. We think they're smart enough to handle it. We think the voice should be coming from the people, and it's not now. And that's why our politics have become damaged. So we look forward to the opportunity to have this in front of you and for you to make that decision, because we think, like we do, that Montanans should be the arbiter of their future and the future of our state. So thanks for being with us tonight. Really appreciate your time and effort. And I usually end these by saying my job in these is usually just to take credit for Lauren's work, because I have to tell you, it has been such a privilege for me to work with this group and coalition of people. That they are so interested in making sure that Montana has a bright future. So I want to thank them too as we get ready to close. So have a great night, everybody, and an awesome weekend. And thanks for being with us.